I call David Seymour.
Mr Speaker, I rise on behalf of the X-Party in support of this bill. And before I give some of the remarks I'd prepared, I have to say there's a certain unreality by what we hear from the opposition. We had one member saying that we are going towards third world conditions. Has he really seen what labour conditions are like in Central America or Africa or Southeast Asia or the Middle East before he says that we in New Zealand are falling short of international standards? Mr Speaker, there's not only an unreality in space but also in time. I wasn't surprised to hear some of our opponents saying that we are going back a century. One said that we're going back 2 centuries. But Mr Speaker, the unreality is this. They are insulting the people that fought for better rights in the 19th century. They don't really understand the differences, and that's why they're so out of place in 2014 in New Zealand. I'd like to congratulate the Minister in charge, the Select Committee, the submitters, the officials involved in getting the bills this far, and I'd also like to acknowledge the work of my X-Party predecessors in approving this bill. And most of all, I'd like to thank my fellow Epsom electors. This bill, more than any other, has acutely demonstrated the role that the Epsom electorate plays and has played in ensuring stable centre-right government in New Zealand. This bill has been advanced, stalled and now advanced again, in each instance due to the presence or absence of an ACT MP from Epsom in this House. I can hear the Labor MP's frustration, Mr Speaker. Not only can we move towards best practice public policy without them, I've heard enough of it, Mr Richard, but ACT has absolute certainty about who their leader is. This is also a teachable moment not only in politics but in public policy, Mr Speaker. Listening to the opposition during the latter part of this debate, they seem to assume that human relations, such as employment relations, are a static affair. They seem to assume they can shift outcomes by legislating the conditions under which people work, and that people will never change their behaviour in response to a change in public policy. An easy way for the opposition to see the fallacy here might be...
Sorry to interrupt the member. Members on their feet, other than those speaking, cannot interject from the floor of the House. David Seymour.
An easy way for the opposition to see the fallacy might be to imagine some of the bill's provisions or proposals in reverse. We might imagine that employees should not be able to abandon a so-called vulnerable employer. Perhaps we'd propose that an employee would be compelled to keep working for such an employer, regardless of what a poor employer they turned out to be, and regardless of what other opportunities presented themselves to that employee. Fanciful? I ask the members to think carefully, what is the logical difference between that scenario and the situation in which large employers continue to be placed under this Act? Or we might imagine an Act wherein employees were thought most likely to tire of bargaining, but require them to conclude an agreement unless the authorities saw fit to absolve them of this default obligation. Or we might imagine a world where it was the norm for employers to partially withhold payment when dissatisfied with employment conditions and to expect no partial reduction in work ethic as a result. Mr Speaker, this bill, even after amendment, let alone the kind of bill the opposition would have passed, is about giving rights to employees by imposing duties on employers. The thought experiment of reversing the roles of employer and employee shows how misguided it is to attempt to improve outcomes by interfering in the contractual arrangements that employees and employers would otherwise enter into. The opposition and any sensible person would reject these hypothetical laws. It's plain to see, I'm sure they'd say, that employees either wouldn't take such jobs or would expect to be paid more in return for accepting such duties. They might even say that such rules would be silly. Far better to relieve employees of such draconian duties and allow them to negotiate their own conditions, I'm sure they would say, if the proposition was put in reverse. Why then do the opponents of flexible labour markets in general, and this bill in particular, not see the futility in trying to legislate a different outcome in the labour market and the damage it is likely to do? Why indeed has the National Party compromised on the vulnerable worker clause and the requirement to conclude bargaining when these should be removed entirely? The answer lies in another fallacy, and we've heard about it from earlier speakers today. It's over 150 years old and disproven every single year since. The fallacy that Labour will fall in value vis-à-vis capital. It's a failed hypothesis, most recently resurrected by a particularly trendy French populist author, that we are heading for hyper-capitalism, and comrade, the revolution's just around the corner. Well, it's been coming for 150 years and it still hasn't come. In reality, it is Labour, not capital, that has risen in value since their mate Mr. Marx wrote. These economic trends have real implications for politics and policy today. They explain why the Labour Party has lost its base and why new members of the Green Party who are very literate in economics might make very effective leaders in the future. But the reality is that the employers in the Epsom electorate and up and down this country are fixated on the challenge of attracting and retaining staff. Competition for workers amongst employers is as aggressive, if not more aggressive, than competition for jobs amongst workers. Those employers must look askance at the opposition's assumption that workers have no other options, or a dime a dozen, and are easy come, easy go. That simply is not the reality of the New Zealand workplace in 2014. It's a marketplace where competition works both ways. And if the gentleman calling out there has any doubt, I entered the workforce 60 hours a week, $7.50 an hour. I support this bill because it's a step in the right direction towards more flexible markets. Like all attempts to improve public policy, this amendment is imperfect. Economic reality and experience suggest it should have gone further. Governments cannot legislate market outcomes, but can influence them. Let me leave the opposition, who I concede have some good intentions, with two initiatives that might better help New Zealanders achieve pay and conditions improved upon what they have now. Nominal pay rates are only worthwhile to the extent that they are useful for buying real goods. The price of houses, for example, have doubled relative to incomes over the last 2 decades, and overwhelmingly this is due to local authorities prescribing an urban development pattern incompatible with the housing people actually want. Far more could be achieved for working New Zealanders by improving the responsiveness of the housing market than by futile attempts to shift bargaining strategies in the labour market. Another contributor to the outcomes in the labour market is the skill level of employees. Employees with greater skills earn more, and this factor is growing in importance. Indeed, increases in inequality of market income in the Western world can be tightly attributed to increasing returns to skills. You can earn more and more increasingly if you are more literate and more numerate. The real work achieving the opposition's purported objectives, I'm pleased to say, is actually already being done on the supply sides of the housing and education sectors, and I'm proud to support and encourage this government in this work. I'm proud to support this bill and hope that this government will one day pursue best practice policy by confronting the fallacies that underlie too much of our labour law legislation. The duty to enter into and conclude bargaining should be gone. The duty to retain staff under Section 6A almost unconditionally dependent on the type of employee, and now the type of business, should also be gone.
2 minutes.
Doing so would put us in touch with the labour market. Doing so might also put the Labour Party in touch with the labour market. It would put us in touch with the 21st century businesses who succeed or fail based on their ability to attract and retain workers. Those are the people I speak for, Mr. Speaker. We haven't heard enough. We haven't heard enough from them so far. I commend this bill to the House.
Yeah.